The fighter screamed through the atmosphere like a dying star, and Kyle Morrison gripped the controls with white knuckles as his entire world shook apart around him, and the warning lights painted his cockpit red and orange, and every alarm that could possibly sound was screaming at him all at once, telling him things he already knew because he could feel the ship. Dying beneath his hands 3 minutes ago, he had been winning the dogfight against the alien raiders, and now he was falling toward an uncharted planet that the scans had promised was dead and empty and safe for emergency landings, but the sensors were clearly wrong because he could see vast green forests spreading below him where there should have been nothing but rock and dust. The whole temperature climbed past critical, and the shields that should have protected him from re-entry had been torn apart by enemy weapons, and pieces of his fighter were burning off and falling away into the clouds below, and Kyle knew with absolute certainty that he was going to crash, and the only question was whether he would survive. ETH fought the controls and managed to angle the nose up just enough to turn his death plunge into something slightly less suicidal, and the treetops rushed up to meet him, and then he was tearing through branches, and metal shrieked against ancient wood, and something massive slammed into the underside of his ship, and the world went spinning. The crash lasted forever and took only seconds, and when the fighter finally stopped moving, Kyle was hanging upside down in his harness with blood running down his forehead and his right arm, screaming with pain, and at least 3 ribs were broken because every breath felt like knives. In his chest, he hit the harness release and fell hard onto what used to be the ceiling of his cockpit, and the pain made Kim gasp. And for a moment the world went gray at the edges, but he forced himself to stay conscious, because passing out in a crashed ship on an unknown planet was a death sentence. Kyle dragged himself out through the torn canopy and collapsed onto soft earth that smelled of things he had never encountered before, and the air was breathable but different and carried scents of growing things and dampness and something else he could not quite identify. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping with it, and Kyle realized with growing horror that the planetary data had been wrong about everything, and if it was wrong about the temperature too, then he was in serious trouble because his flight suit was designed for controlled environments, not wilderness survival. He pulled himself upright using a piece of wreckage and nearly screamed from the pain in his ribs, and his right arm hung useless at his side, and he was pretty sure it was broken in at least 2 places, and the blood from the cut on his forehead kept dripping into his eyes. The emergency kit was still intact in the tail section, and Kyle stumbled toward it and pulled out the survival beacon and the medical supplies and a thermal blanket that would do almost nothing against cold this deep, but it was better than nothing. He activated the beacon and watched its light pulse into the darkening sky, and knew that help would not come quickly because no one knew he was here, and his ship had been knocked so far off course during the fight that search and rescue would be looking in completely the wrong sector. The cold was already biting through his flight suit, and Kyle made a decision that would change everything, though he did not know it yet, and he gathered pieces of wreckage that would burn and cleared a space on the ground and used the emergency igniter to start a fired. The flames caught quickly on the fuel residue still coating some of the debris, and soon he had a proper fire burning, and the heat felt like salvation against the growing cold, and Kyle huddled close to it and used his one good hand to inject himself with painkillers from the medical kite. Did not know that fire was forbidden on this world, and he did not know that flames were the ancient signal for war, and he did not know that lighting that fire was the worst possible thing he could have done. The forest around him had gone silent when the ship crashed, but now Kyle began to hear sounds returning, and they were not the sounds he expected, and something large moved through the trees beyond the firelight, and he caught glimpses of shapes that did not match any animal he had ever studied. His hand went to his sidearm, and he drew it with his left hand because his right was useless, and he aimed at the darkness and waited, and the painkillers were starting to make swim, but he forced himself to stay alert. The first one stepped into the firelight, and Kyle forgot how to breathe. She was tall and moved with a grace that seemed impossible, and her features were sharp and elegant in ways that reminded him of old stories from Earth about beings that were not quite human, and her eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back like an animal, and they were too large and too bright and far and intelligent. She wore armor that looked grown rather than forged. and it seemed to be made of materials that shifted color in the firelight, and she carried a weapon that was part spear and part something else entirely, with a blade that seemed to be carved from crystal or bone or both behind her. Something much larger moved in the shadows, and Kyle saw scales that reflected red and gold in the firelight, and steam rose in great plumes from nostrils he could not quite see, and the shape was massive and wrong and impossible. The woman looked at him and then at the fire, and something changed in her expression, and it was not anger exactly, but something colder and more dangerous, and she spoke words in a language Kyle had never heard, and her voice had a musical quality that was beautiful and terrifying. All at once Kyle tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry, and the painkillers were making everything feel distant and unreal, and he wondered if he was. And she gestured at the fire and then at him, and Kyle understood somehow that she was asking him something, but he had no idea what. More figures emerged from the forest, and they were all like her, with that same impossible grace and those same two bright eyes, and they surrounded him and the fire, and some of them had weapons drawn, while others simply watched, and the massive shape in the shadows moved closer. Kyle saw it fully then, and his mind tried to reject what his eyes were telling him, because it could not be real, and yet it was, and the creature was a dragon, and there was no other word for it, with scales that gleamed like metal and wings that were folded against its back, and eyes that burned with intelligence that matched the woman standing before him. The dragon lowered its great head and regarded Kyle with what might have been curiosity, and its breath washed over him, hot and smelling of sulfur and smoke, and Kyle realized that he was staring at something that should not exist. The woman with the crystal weapon stepped closer and knelt beside him, and her movements were careful and controlled, and she reached out with one hand and touched his broken arm, and Kyle gasped at the pain. She pulled back immediately and spoke again, and this time there was something almost like concern in her voice, and she looked at his injuries and then back at the fire, and seemed to be making some kind of decision. Another woman approached, and this one was older, with silver streaking her dark hair, and she wore more elaborate armor and carried herself with obvious authority, and she spoke sharply to the first woman in that musical language the two women argued, and Kyle caught the tone, if not the words, and he understood that his fate was being decided right now beside his illegal fire on a world that was supposed to be empty. Older woman looked at him with eyes that seemed to see everything, and she spoke one word that sounded like a command, and the first woman nodded reluctantly. They bound his hands with vines that glowed faintly in the darkness, and the material was stronger than any rope Kyle had ever encountered. And when he tried to pull against them, they simply tightened until he stopped struggling. The first woman helped him to his feet with surprising gentleness and gestured for him to walk, and Kyle stumbled forward on legs that barely supported him, and the world tilted and spun. The dragon moved beside them as they walked, and its scales brushed against him once, and they were warm and smoother than he expected, and the creature made a sound deep in its chest that might have been curiosity or warning. They led him away from his fire and his crashed ship into the forest, where more of them waited, and Kyle saw structures in the trees that were carved from living wood, and paths that glowed faintly with the same light as his bonzi had made first contact with a species humanity did not know existed, and he had done it by breaking their most sacred law. And Kyle Morrison understood with perfect clarity that he had just started something that could not be stopped. Kyle woke in a chamber that seemed carved from crystal, and the walls pulsed with soft blue light, and his head felt clearer than it had any right to after the crash, and the pain in his ribs was gone, and when he looked at his arm, he found it wrapped in something that looked like living moss but felt warm and soothing against his skin. The woman from the forest sat nearby, and her dragon companion lay curled behind her with its massive head resting on its front claws, and both of them watched him with those two bright eyes. And Kyle sat up, slowly testing his body for injuries. Everything worked, and the pain was manageable, and he realized they had healed him at least partially, and he looked at the woman and tried to speak, but she held up one hand. She reached out and pressed something against his temple, and it was smooth and cool and felt almost alive, and Kyle jerked back, but she held it there firmly and spoke soft words in her language. Then the words changed and became something He could almost understand, and his head filled with images and concepts that were not quite language but somehow conveyed meaning, and Kyle gasped as understanding flooded through him. The device was teaching him, and he could feel it working in his mind. And the woman spoke again, and this time he understood fragments of what she said, and her name was something like Lyra, though the actual sound was more complex than that. Shit showed him through the device what he had done wrong, and Kyle saw images of fire and war and ancient battles, and he understood that lighting the fire had been a signal on this world. Fire meant invasion and danger and a call to arms. The Sylvari had been hidden for thousands of years, and they had survived by staying invisible to the species that moved through the stars and humanity. Found them by accident, but accidents could lead to invasion, and invasion meant extinction, and they had learned this lesson. Too many times before, Lyra showed him memories that were not his own, and Kyle saw worlds burning and civilizations falling, and the Sylvari running and hiding and fighting and dying. And through it all, there were the dragons bound to them in ways he could not fully comprehend. She removed the device, and Kyle sat back and tried to process what he had learned, and his head spun with concepts that human science said were impossible. And yet they were real and sitting right in front of him. Lyra spoke, and now he understood most of it. And she told him that the council would decide his fate, and some wanted him dead because dead humans could not bring more humans, and others wanted to use him to understand the threat. And Kyle realized he was a prisoner, but also possibly the only thing keeping his species from walking into a war they could not possibly win. The dragon raised its head and made a sound that was almost like words, and Kyle felt the meaning in his mind somehow, and the creature was asking him questions about why humans flew alone in metal shells when living things were so much better. Kyle tried to explain about ships and technology, and the dragon seemed unimpressed and suggested that humans were missing something fundamental about the universe, and Kyle could not really argue with that. They took him deeper into the city, and Kyle saw wonders that made his training seem worthless, and there were buildings that grew from the earth itself, and lights that had no obvious source, and everywhere there were the Sylvari moving with that impossible grace, and many of them had dragons walking beside them. Council chamber was vast and carved from a single massive crystal, and the floor was smooth as glass and reflected everything, and around the edges sat the leaders of this hidden civilization. The silver-haired woman from the forest was there, and Kyle learned her name was Kira, and she was the matriarch, and her eyes held centuries of pain and hard decisions, and when she looked at him, he felt weighed and measured, and found wanting. Another woman stood to speak, and she was younger, with fierce eyes and dark red hair, and her dragon was crimson-scaled and massive, and this was Maya, and she led the warriors, and her voice carried the weight of command. Maya argued that Kyle represented something new and dangerous, but also possibly useful, and humanity was fighting a war against the Zithric Empire, and the Zithric were the same species that had driven the Sylvari into hiding millennia ago. If the Zithroc found this world, they would destroy it, and Maya said that perhaps the enemy of their enemy could be something more than just another threat, and perhaps humans could be taught to fight properly before the Zithrak found the Malkira. Countered that humans had proven themselves capable of terrible things, and the archives showed colony massacres and xenocide protocols and casual cruelty that came from species who saw themselves as destined to rule, and bringing humans here might save them from the Zithrak, only to doom them to human conquest. Instead, Lyra spoke, and her voice was quieter, but no less firm, and she had touched Kyle's mind through the device and seen his memories and his motivations, and yes, humans were capable of terrible things, but so were all species when they were afraid and desperate, and Kyle had fought to protect others, not for conquest. Council argued, and Kyle sat in the center, unable to speak, without permission, and watching his fate being decided by beings who had every reason to kill him, and no reason to trust him. Finally, Maya stood and spoke again, and she proposed Eclipse Protocol, and the chamber went silent, and even Kira looked shocked, and Kyle did not know what that meant. But he could feel the weight of it. Eclipse Protocol was ancient. It had not been used since the Sylvari Empire fell, and it meant sending an envoy to make contact and giving the other species one chance to prove themselves worthy of alliance or revealing themselves as another enemy to be eliminated. Kira argued against it, because once revealed they could not hide again, and if humanity chose wrong, then the Sylvari would have to fight a war on two fronts, against both humans and Zithric. But Maya pressed forward and said that hiding had kept them alive, but it had also kept them alone and weak, and the Zithric were coming whether they hid or not. And when they came, the Sylvari would die quietly in the dark, unless they found allies who could help them fight. The vote was called, and the council split down the middle, and Kira as matriarch held the deciding vote, and for a long moment she simply stared at Kyle. And he met her eyes and tried to show her that humanity was worth the Riscara voted yes, and the chamber erupted in voices raised in protest and support. And Kyle realized that his survival had just been guaranteed, but also that he had just become responsible for either saving or dooming two entire species. They gave him limited freedom within their boundaries, and Lyra was assigned as his guard, and her dragon Ashenkra watched him constantly, and Kyle learned their language properly now, and began to understand the depth of what he had stumbled into then. Sylvari had technology that made human science look primitive, and their ships were grown, not built, and they could fold space in ways that left no trace, and their weapons could tear through dimensions and strike from angles that should not exist. But they were also few and scattered and afraid, and they had been running for so long that some of them had forgotten how to do anything else. Skyle watched the young warriors training with their dragons and saw the bond between them, and it was deeper than any partnership humans had, and the dragon and rider thought as one, and moved as one, and fought with coordination that no AI could match. Ashenkra spoke to him often now, and her voice in his mind was ancient and curious, and she asked him about flying alone, and he tried to explain that humans had not found the way to bond with other species like the Sylvari. Had the dragon suggested that perhaps humans had not looked hard enough, and maybe they were afraid of sharing their minds and their souls, and Kyle could not really argue with that either. Maya took him to see the hidden armada, and Kyle stood in a vast cavern deep in the planet's core and stared at ships that looked alive, because they were, and there were hundreds of them waiting and growing and preparing for a war that might never come or might come tomorrow. These vessels could destroy human fleets without being detected, and Maya told him this plainly and without pride, and she wanted him to understand what humanity would face if the council decided humans were a threat. Kyle asked her why she had voted for Eclipse Protocol if the Sylvari were so powerful, and Maya looked at him with tired eyes and said that power meant nothing if you died alone, and the Sylvari had been alone for too long. She showed him the archives of past battles, and Kyle saw the Zithric, and they were nightmare creatures that fought with religious certainty, and they believed all other species were abominations that needed to be cleansed from the universe. The Sylvari had fought them 3 times and lost 3 times and retreated 3 times, and now there was nowhere left to run, and when the Zithrak came again, it would be the last battle. That night Kyle lay in his crystal chamber and stared at the glowing walls and thought about choices and consequences, and wondered if lighting that fire had been the luckiest or unluckiest thing he had ever done. Outside his window he could see dragons flying through the night sky, and they were beautiful and terrible and completely impossible, and yet they were real, and humanity had no idea what existed in the universe beyond their small sphere of explored space. Thought about Admiral Branson and the 7th Fleet, and how they would react to first contact with a species that could destroy them without being seen, and he thought about the Zithrak coming to finish. What? The weeks passed in a blur of learning, and Kyle found himself understanding more of the Sylvari world than he had ever thought possible. And Lyra remained his constant companion, and through her, he learned about the civilization that humanity had nearly discovered by accident. The Sylvari were not just survivors, but inheritors of something vast and ancient, and their empire had once spanned a dozen worlds connected by fold gates that could move entire populations in heartbeats, and they had built wonders that made human technology look like children playing with rocks. Their downfall had come not from weakness, but from mercy, and they had welcomed other species and shared their knowledge and tried to build something peaceful and lasting. And then the Zithrak had come. The Zithrak did not negotiate or compromise, and they saw all other intelligent life as competition for resources that rightfully belonged only to them, and they fought with the certainty of religious zealots and the efficiency of perfect coordination. The first Sylvari worlds fell before anyone understood what was happening, and the empire that had taken millennia to build came apart in decades, and the survivors fled with whatever they could carry, and the dragons that had been their partners in peace became their weapons in war. Kyle learned about the bonding process and how each dragon chose their partner in ways that no Sylvari fully understood, and the bond went deeper than telepathy or empathy and became something that merged two minds into one purpose without destroying either individual. Ocean Craw explained it to him as they sat on a platform overlooking the city, and her thoughts in his mind were clear now, and she said that humans were lonely creatures because they lived entirely inside their own heads and never really touched another mind. She asked him if he was afraid of sharing himself that completely, and Kyle admitted that yes, he was terrified of it because humans valued independence and individuality, and the idea of merging with another consciousness seemed like losing yourself. Dragon made a sound that was almost laughter and told him that bonding did not erase who you were, but made you more than you could be alone. And perhaps humans were not ready for that kind of trust. Lyra took him to the neural archives where Sylvari stored their memories and knowledge in crystalline matrices that could be accessed by anyone with the right training, and Kyle experienced history as if he had lived it himself. He saw the Sylvari Empire at its height and walked through cities that floated in the clouds and swam in oceans that sparkled with bioluminescent life, and attended gatherings where 100 species came together to share art and philosophy and science. Then he saw the first Zithrek ships arrive, and they were dark in chitinous and moved through space like locusts, and they did not respond to hails or offers of peace, and they simply began destroying everything. They encountered the memories of those first battles were fragmentary, because so few survived to record them, and Kyle felt the confusion and terror of a peaceful civilization suddenly forced to fight for its existence against an enemy that gave no quarter. The Sylvari had adapted and learned, and built weapons that could match the Zithrak, and for a while they held their own, but the Zithrak kept coming in waves that never seemed to end, and slowly the Empire crumbled. The retreat to this world had been desperate and chaotic, and they had lost so much in the evacuation, and entire cultural traditions and scientific advances and works of art had been abandoned or destroyed, and what remained was a shadow of what had been. Maya found him after he emerged from the archives, and she could tell from his expression that he had seen the truth, and she asked him if he understood now why the Sylvari were so cautious about revealing themselves. Kyle told her that he understood, but that hiding forever was not really living, and Maya smiled grimly and said that survival was better than extinction, even if it meant living small and afraid. She took him deeper into the mountain, two places even most Sylvari never saw, and showed him weapons that had been forbidden since the last war, and some of them were genetic plagues designed to target specific species, and others were dimensional bombs that could fold entire star systems into pocket universes and erase them from existence. These were the tools of desperation, and Maya said they had been built during the darkest days of the retreat, when it seemed the Zithrik would follow them anywhere and exterminate them completely. Kyle asked if they would use these weapons on humanity if the Eclipse protocol failed, and Maya did not answer immediately, and when she finally spoke, she said that the Council hoped it would not come to that, but yes, they would do whatever was necessary to survive. They reached the heart of the hidden Armada, and Kyle stood on a platform overlooking a cavern so vast he could not see the far walls, and ships hung in growth cradles like strange fruit, and some were small and sleek, while others were massive dreadnoughts designed to crack planets. These ships were alive in ways human vessels could never be, and they responded to their pilots' thoughts and could repair themselves and grow new weapons as needed, and each one was unique because they grew organically rather than being manufactured. Small ship detached from its cradle and floated over to where they stood, and it was beautiful in an alien way, with lines that flowed like water and a hull that seemed to shift colors as it moved, and Maya said this was a scout ship and it would be perfect for the Eclipse Protocol mission. Lyra joined them, and Kyle saw her expression change when she looked at the ship, and he realized She had been chosen as the envoy, and that meant she would be coming with him back to human space the dragon. Ashenkra landed beside them with an impact that shook the platform, and she was clearly not happy about the arrangement, and her thoughts were loud enough that Kyle could sense them even without the direct connection. She did not trust humans, and did not want Lyra going into potential danger, and Maya spoke to the dragon in their language and explained that this was necessary, and that Lyra had volunteered because she had the strongest connection to Kyle and the best chance of making humans understand. The ship bonded with both of them in a ceremony that involved touching the living hull and letting it taste their blood, and Kyle felt the ship's consciousness brush against his mind, curious and young and eager it would carry them to human space and bring them back, and if they died, it would return alone and tell the council what had happened, and that thought was not particularly comforting. Kyle spent his last days on the Sylvari homeworld, learning everything he could, and the young warriors taught him about dimensional combat and how to think in 3 dimensions plus time and predict where enemies would fold to. He learned about Sylvari culture and their music, which was based on harmonic frequencies that human ears could barely perceive, in their art, which involved growing sculptures from living crystal that changed over centuries. Lyra showed him her personal history, and she had been bonded to Ashenkra for 70 years, which seemed impossible because she looked perhaps 30 in human terms, and Kyle learned that Sylvari aged differently, especially after bonding with dragons. She had fought in border skirmishes against pirates and explored dead worlds looking for lost Sylvari artifacts, and once she had spent 5 years alone on a moon studying the migration patterns of crystalline life forms. Kyle shared his own history through the neural link and showed her growing up on a colony world and joining the fleet and fighting in the early battles against raiders who turned out to be Zithrak scouts. Lyra was surprised that humans had already encountered the Zithrak and did not know what they were, and Kyle explained that humanity thought they were just another hostile species, not an existential threat to all intelligent life. The neural link worked both ways, and Kyle felt Lyra's emotions and fears and hopes, and she was terrified that Eclipse Protocol would fail and humanity would prove to be just another enemy, in the Sylvari would have revealed themselves for nothing. But she also hoped desperately that it would work, because living in hiding was slowly killing her people, and they needed allies and purpose and a reason to stop being afraid. The day came to depart, and the council gathered to see them off, and Kira spoke formally about duty and sacrifice and the weight of representing an entire civilization, and Kyle felt the pressure of it settle on his shoulders. Maya pulled him aside and gave him a data crystal that contained detailed tactical information about the Zithrak and their weapons and strategies and fighting styles, and she said that if humanity proved worthy, this would help them survive what was coming. Then she looked him in the eyes and said that if humanity proved false, he should know that the Sylvari would not hesitate and would not show mercy and would burn human civilization from the stars before allowing themselves to be discovered and destroyed. Kyle promised to do everything he could to make the alliance work, and Maya nodded and said she believed him, but belief was not the same as certainty. Lyra and Ashenkra said their farewells, and the dragon maid Kyle promised to keep her bonded partner safe, and Kyle said he would try, and Ashenkra said that trying was not good enough, but she would accept his oath anyway. Ship opened to receive them, and inside it was warm and smelled faintly of growing things, and the walls pulsed with gentle light, and Kyle could feel the vessel's eagerness to fly. They lifted off from the platform and rose through the cavern, up through shafts that opened before them and closed. Admiral Lisa Branson had seen many strange things in her 30 years with the fleet, but nothing quite prepared her for the transmission coming from Thunder Ridge Station, and the watch officer sounded uncertain and maybe a little terrified when he reported that Lieutenant Kyle Morrison had just appeared in an alien vessel claiming to have made first contact with a hidden civilization, pulled up the sensor data, and stared at readings that made no sense because the ship in question had appeared without any fold signature, and its energy output was completely unlike anything in the human database, and it seemed to be partially organic, which should have been identification codes checked out, in the voice pattern matched Kyle Morrison, who had been listed as missing in action for 3 months after his fighter had been destroyed during a border skirmish, and officially he was presumed dead. Lisa gave the ship 30 seconds to explain before she ordered weapons. Hot and Kyle's voice came through the channel clear and urgent, and he said he needed to speak with Fleet Command immediately because humanity was in danger, and he had brought someone who could help. The someone in question appeared on the holographic display, and Lisa felt her breath catch because the being was clearly not human and looked like something from ancient mythology, with features that were too perfect and too sharp, and eyes that seemed to see right through the camera. Lyra introduced herself and spoke flawless standard English. Though her accent was strange and musical, she said the Sylvari had been watching humanity for decades and had remained hidden, but now circumstances demanded they reveal themselves. She explained about the Zithric and the approaching fleet and the threat to both species, and Lisa listened with growing horror, because if this was true, then humanity was facing extinction from an enemy. They had barely encountered Lisa, made a decision that would either save her career or end it, and she agreed to send one ship with Kyle to the coordinates Lyra provided, and if this turned out to be a trap, then at least they would know what they were dealing with. The destroyer Valiant was chosen because Captain Helen Price was both capable and flexible enough to handle first contact without starting a war, and her crew was experienced enough to recognize genuine threats versus misunderstandings. Helen had her doubts when the orders came through, but she trusted Admiral Branson, and besides the alternative was ignoring a potential threat until it was too late. And that was how civilizations died. The Valiant jumped to the coordinates with Kyle aboard, and Lyra had returned to her homeworld to prepare for their arrival, and the human crew were nervous because they were heading into completely unknown territory with only the word of one pilot that this was not a suicide mission. When they dropped out of fold space, Helen had to grip her command chair to keep from showing her shock because her sensors showed a planet that should not exist, and then the shroud peeled back, like layers of reality being stripped away, and she saw cities and ships and dragons. Her tactical officer reported that they were surrounded by vessels that had appeared from nowhere and could destroy the Valiant before they finished charging weapons, and Helen ordered her crew to stand down and wait. Lyra appeared in the view screen, riding on a Shenkra's back, and the dragon landed on the Valiant's hull with an impact that rattled the entire ship, and Helen heard her crew gasping and swearing. And trying to process what they were seeing, the first contact protocols had not prepared them for dragons, and Helen felt a hysterical laugh building in her throat, but she suppressed it, and instead opened communications and said they were here to learn. Lyra invited Helen and a small team to the surface and promised safe passage, and Helen chose her security chief, Nina Vasquez, and her science officer, Greg Palmer, and Kyle because he knew the territory. The shuttle ride down was quiet because none of them knew what to say, and Helen watched the cities grow larger and saw beings moving through them with impossible grace, and she realized humanity had been alone in a crowded universe. The matriarch, Kira, met them in a hall carved from crystal, and she looked ancient and tired and powerful, and Helen felt herself being evaluated and judged, and she stood straight and met those golden eyes without flinching. Kara spoke, and her words were translated through devices the Sylvari provided, and she said that humanity stood at a crossroads, and the choice they made now would determine whether both species survived. Ordici showed them the archives, and Helen watched through Neuralink technology as the Zithric destroyed worlds and exterminated species, and fought with religious certainty that all other life was an abomination. The Zithric fleet was 5 weeks out and heading for both the hidden Sylvari world and the human colony cluster at Theta 9, which held 8 million civilians, and neither target could be evacuated in time. Helen felt cold certainty settle in her gut because this was real, and the threat was immediate, and if she did nothing, then millions would. Demaya took them to see the hidden Armada, and Helen walked among ships that looked alive because they were, and she understood both the opportunity and the danger, because these vessels could save humanity or destroy it depending on choices made in the next few hours. The science officer, Greg, was recording everything with wide eyes and muttering about technologies that broke known physics, and Helen let him because someone needed to document this, even if no one would believe them. Later, Nina stood rigid and alert and kept one hand near her weapon, though Helen suspected it would do nothing against beings who could grow ships and bond with dragons and fold space without leaving traces. Kyle seemed comfortable here in a way that worried Helen, because 3 months ago he had been a promising pilot and now he moved through alien cities like he belonged. There she pulled him aside and asked him directly if this was real or some kind of elaborate deception, and Kyle looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said it was real, and humanity needed to decide quickly whether they wanted allies or enemies. Helen made contact with Admiral Branson through quantum entanglement, communicators that took forever to establish connection, and explained everything she had seen and heard, and Lisa listened without interrupting the silence after Helen finished speaking, stretched for long seconds, and then Lisa said she would bring the 7th Fleet. They would prepare for the Zithrak together, because there was no other choice that made sense. Alliance formed not from trust but from necessity, and the 7th Fleet arrived in the system. Within 4 days, and 40 human warships joined the Silvari Armada, and the crews stared at bioships and dragons and tried to adapt to a universe that had suddenly become much stranger. Admiral Branson met with Kira and Maya and the 3 commanders, began planning the defense against an enemy none of the humans had ever truly fought. The differences were immediate and frustrating, and human commanders wanted clear chains of command and rigid battle plans, while Silvari warriors fought as bonded pairs and hunting packs that relied on intuition and fluid tactics. Helen found herself working directly with Maya, and the Silvari commander was brilliant but thought in ways that made human military doctrines seem clumsy and predictable. They argued about formations and weapon deployment and targeting priorities, and slowly began to find common ground. Because underneath the different approaches, they shared the same goal. Nina ran joint training exercises and watched human pilots try to coordinate with dragon riders, and it was chaos at first because the Silvari moved in 3 dimensions with casual ease, while human fighters were used to more predictable patterns. But the humans learned and adapted, and some of the younger pilots showed genuine talent for dimensional combat, and Nina saw potential for something new if they survived long enough to develop it. Greg worked with Silvari scientists, and his head spun with concepts that human physics said were impossible, and he revised entire theories based on what he learned and sent detailed reports back to Fleet Command that read like science fiction. Kyle became a bridge between both species, and he translated not just language, but culture and philosophy, and helped humans understand why Silvari did things that seemed strange, and helped Silvari understand human concerns. Lyra stayed close to him, and they moved through both camps together, and the bond between them had deepened during their journey, and some of the Silvari wondered if Kyle might be capable of bonding with a dragon eventually. Ashenkra was less skeptical of humans now, and she had met several who impressed her with their courage and determination, and she admitted to Kyle that maybe humans were not entirely hopeless. The days passed in frantic preparation, and weapons were tested and strategies developed in both fleets, trained together until the coordination improved from terrible to merely bad. Zithrak arrived early and caught everyone by surprise, because their fold technology was even more advanced than expected, and they translated into the system with perfect precision. Their fleet was enormous and dark, and the ships looked grown from chitin and twisted metal, and they moved with insect coordination, and every sensor that touched them reported the same thing, which was hunger and certainty, and death. Admiral Branson stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the enemy fleet deploy, and she felt fear that she did not allow to show, because her people needed her to be strong. Kira stood in her command center, surrounded by holographic displays showing the entire battle space, and the Zithrak retreat was not organized, but pure survival instinct, as their command structure collapsed and individual ships began folding a way to escape the combined fury of human and Silvari forces, and within minutes, the enemy fleet that had seemed unstoppable was breaking apart and fleeing. Admiral Lisa Branson watched from her flagship as the last Zithrak vessel vanished into fold space, and she wanted to feel victorious, but instead, she felt exhausted and sad because the cost had been terrible, 7 human ships were destroyed completely, and another dozen were crippled. Beyond field repair, and thousands of crew members were dead or dying, and Lisa had sent every one of them into battle, knowing some would not return the Sylvari. Losses were equally devastating, and dozens of bioships floated dead in space. Their organic systems too damaged to regenerate, and hundreds of dragons had fallen, taking their bonded riders with them. And that was a loss the Sylvari felt more deeply than humans could understand. Helen brought the Valiant limping back toward the fleet with half her crew injured and her ship venting atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches, and Nina was in the medical bay with burns across her back, but she would survive. Greg was already compiling data from the battle and trying to understand how Zithrak's shields adapted and how their weapons worked, and his reports would change. Human military technology for decades, Kyle and Lyra landed their battered fighter on a silvery carrier, and both of them were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, and Ashenkra had taken damage to her wing but insisted she was fine even though she clearly was. Not the dragon had saved Kyle's life 3 times during the battle by positioning herself between his fighter and incoming fire, and Kyle had returned the favor by destroying the Zithrak vessel that had been targeting Lyra, and they had fought as a unit in ways neither had thought possible. Maya emerged from the captured Zithrak flagship covered in ichor and burns, and Varantis limped beside her with one of his horns shattered but his eyes still burning bright, and together they had led the assault that broke the enemy command. The cost of that victory was written on Maya's face, and she had lost warriors she had known for decades and dragons who had been her friends and allies, and the weight of their deaths would stay with her forever. Surveyed the battlefield from her command center, and felt the familiar ache of survival that came at too high a price, and she had lived through too many battles and lost too many people, and every victory felt more like temporary reprieve than triumph, but they had won and both species had survived, and the alliance, forged in desperation, had proven itself in blood and fire, and that meant something even if the cost had been terrible. The human fleet began recovery operations, pulling survivors from disabled ships and treating the wounded and collecting the dead for proper burial, and the Sylvari did the same, gathering their fallen and preparing ceremonies that humans did not fully understand. Admiral Branson requested a meeting with Kira and Maya, and they gathered in a conference room aboard the human flagship because the matriarch wanted to see how humans lived and worked. The room was stark and functional compared to Sylvari spaces, and Kira found it oddly comforting in its simplicity, and Lisa offered water and simple food, and they sat together. 3 commanders who had just survived the impossible. Lisa spoke first and thanked Kira for the warning and the alliance, because without it, the Zithrak would have destroyed Theta 9 and killed millions, and humanity would never have known what hit them. Kira responded that the Sylvari were equally grateful, because fighting alone, they would have been overwhelmed, and perhaps this time they could stop running and start building something better. Maya added that the Zithrak would return eventually, because they always did, but next time both species would be ready, and together they were stronger than either could be alone. They began discussing permanent alliance terms, and it was complicated because humans had governments and politics and bureaucracies, while Sylvari had councils and traditions and consensus, and neither system mapped well onto the other. But they found common ground in practical matters and agreed to mutual defense treaties and technology exchange programs and cultural liaison positions, and the details would take years to work out, but the foundation was solid. Lisa asked about the hidden armada and whether the Sylvari would share that technology, and Kira said yes, but slowly, because some weapons were to give 2 species that were not ready, and humans were still young and impulsive. Maya argued that humans had proven themselves in battle and earned the right to be treated as equals, not children, and Kira acknowledged this, but insisted on gradual exchange with proper training. They've compromised on joint development programs where human engineers and Sylvari bioship growers would work together and create new vessels that combined the best of both approaches. Helen joined the meeting later and brought data from the battle that showed how human and Sylvari tactics complemented each other, and she proposed permanent joint training exercises and mixed crew assignments. Nina sent a report about human Marines fighting alongside Sylvari strike teams and how they had covered each other's weaknesses and created combinations that were more effective than either group alone. Greg submitted 300 pages of technical analysis and requests for access to Sylvari scientists, and Kira actually laughed when she read it and said humans were certainly enthusiastic learners. The alliance became official 3 days after the battle, when representatives from both species signed documents that established mutual recognition and permanent cooperation. And humans were no longer alone in the universe. The Sylvari agreed to reveal themselves gradually to other human colonies and to share knowledge about the Zithrak threat and other dangers that existed beyond human space. Humanity agreed to provide military support and industrial capacity, and to help the Sylvari reconnect with their scattered survivors who had fled to different worlds and hidden for centuries. The news spread through human space and caused chaos and celebration and fear and wonder, and some people welcomed the alliance while others feared it, and politicians argued about implications, and journalists demanded access. But those who had fought in the battle knew the truth, which was that the alliance was necessary and good, and would make both species stronger. Kyle and Lyra returned to the Sylvari homeworld and stood together, looking at the forest, where his ship had crashed months ago, and the fire he had lit was long since cold, but its effects were still burning. Crashed Fighter was now a monument covered in plants and flowers and young. Sylvari came here to see where first contact had happened, and to remember that sometimes mistakes could lead to miraculous. Sashenkra settled beside them, and she admitted to Kyle that she had been wrong about humans, and they were capable of growth and change, and maybe even bonding, though that would take time. Kyle told the dragon that he would be honored to attempt bonding someday if she and Lyra thought he was ready, and Ashenkra made a rumbling laugh sound and said perhaps in a few decades when he was more mature. Lyra smiled and said that humans and Sylvari had very different timelines, and Kyle would need to be patient and learn to think in centuries rather than years. They talked about the future and what it might hold, and Lyra said she wanted to visit human worlds and see how they lived, and Kyle said he would show her everything from orbital stations to colony farms to old Earth if they could get permission. The treaty included provisions for exchange programs where humans could study on Sylvari worlds and Sylvari could visit human space, and both species would learn from each other. Young warriors from both sides competed in training exercises, and the initial hostility gave way to respect and then friendship, and some of them began forming bonds that crossed species lines. Human pilots learned to fight in 3 dimensions and think in terms of fold space and probability fields, and their combat effectiveness increased. Dramaticalislavir warriors learned human tactics for coordinated fleet actions and industrial warfare and combined arms operations, and they admitted grudgingly that humans were very good at organized violence. The dragons were fascinated by human technology, and several of them asked to bond with willing pilots, and the first human dragon riders became celebrities and symbols of the alliance. Scientists from both species collaborated on projects that neither could have accomplished alone, and they made breakthroughs in fold drive technology and energy weapons and medical treatments. Human doctors learned Sylvari healing techniques and began using organic technologies to repair injuries that previously would have been permanent. Sylvari physicians studied human medicine and were impressed by surgical techniques and pharmaceutical approaches they had never considered. The cultural exchange was equally rich, and human artists created works inspired by Sylvari aesthetics, and Sylvari musicians incorporated human instruments and rhythms. Food became a diplomatic tool, and humans introduced Sylvari to coffee and chocolate and spices, while Sylvari shared fruits and preparations that humans had no words for. Children from both species met in schools established specifically for cultural education, and they learned each other's languages and histories and formed friendships that would last lifetimes. The first mixed crews took to space aboard vessels that combined human engineering and Sylvari biotech, and they patrolled the borders watching for Zithrak scouts.